Russian forces managed to flank the eastern apartment complex area of Pokrovsk, which is the final stronghold of Ukrainian forces within the city, storming the fortifications along the highway connecting to Donetsk in the north. The Russians are now less than 2 kilometers from gaining full control over the highway, which then leads to the full encirclement of Milnorad. In addition to this, the Russians started storming the industrial area in the western outskirts of Rivne, eastern outskirts of Pokrovsk, where they're looking to gain control over the remaining oil depot areas, which will complete the encirclement of the apartment complex area in the eastern parts of the city. They also managed to advance, gain control over the school in the central parts of the city, where the Ukrainians remain under control over a small portion of the residential area. This leaves the Ukrainian forces within Pokrovsk in 3 separate pockets of about even size in the central and eastern parts of the city, in addition to the Dacha area and the northern outskirts. All in all, about 10% remains under Ukrainian control. On the wider front, the Russians and the Ukrainians managed to make several advances across the front line. The Russians reversed this situation in the western flank of Stepnohirsk, meaning significant gains along the Dnieper River. They also managed to advance to the north of Dashne, south of Novopavlivka, here along the border between the Dnipropetrovsk and Donetsk region. The Russians also managed to advance within Pokrovsk itself, as we just covered, and on the northern flank, where the Ukrainians are also confirming some of their previous advances in that direction, the northern flank of Rodinsk. In the direction of Kostiantynivka, continuous advances by the Russians, as well as in the Leman section of the front line. The Ukrainians managed to recapture some positions along the eastern bank of the Oskil River line, and again some grey zones have been clarified in the northern flank of Kamyanka, with some additional Ukrainian gains as they continue counterattacks on the northern flank of the town. The Russians also managed to secure the remaining parts of Kamyanka in the Kupiansk-Kharkiv direction. The advances by the Russians here in the Pokrovsk direction are significant for the encirclement of Milnorad and the surrounding settlements of Svitle, Rivne, Sukhyar, and Lysivka. The Ukrainians are attempting to withdraw from the southern settlements up towards Milnorad, where they're looking to establish their positions within the city and slow down the Russians as much as possible while holding on to the city, while they are also attempting a withdrawal to redirect their forces to the Pokrovsk direction. However, the Russians have been successful in their offensive operations within Pokrovsk, continuously kicking the Ukrainians out of the city and reaching the outskirts of it in the eastern and northern directions. The Russians are here working on gaining full control over the northern flank of Pokrovsk, including the fortifications and the outskirts of it, as well as gaining control over the last stronghold of the Ukrainians, which is the northeastern apartment complex area, and push into Rivne and Svitle, here on the western flank of Milnorad. I doubt that the Russians will look to actually close the encirclement of Milnorad unless a large enough amount of Ukrainian soldiers have withdrawn, because a large encirclement of Milnorad will take a lot of time to clear, while the capture of the highway leading through Pokrovsk and Pokrovsk as a logistical hub, and the less fighting takes place within the city, the more intact the city itself is for the use of Russian forces, which will then allow them to develop offensive operations along the highways in the northern and northwestern directions. Therefore, the Russians have an interest in leaving the exit open, even if Ukrainian soldiers survive. The loss of the city and the fortifications means a lot for the continuous fighting, and the Ukrainians will also be taking losses during such a withdrawal, which then adds to the reasons why the Russians will be looking to let them escape. In addition to this, the fighting that takes place during an encirclement is no longer that Russian soldiers storm the Ukrainian positions or vice versa, but instead that they are using FPV drones to clear pockets. That means if a Ukrainian group of forces is encircled in Milnorad, the Russians will take up positions on a perimeter around the encirclement and then launch FPV drones within it to clear all of the Ukrainian positions. They also need to be resupplied. This is usually done by drones. That means they have reconnaissance drones that look for Ukrainian drones, and once these supplies enter a location, they'll detect the Ukrainian soldier, and then they will strike the positions of the Ukrainians. The Russian capture of Pokrovsk was extremely slow, then suddenly it started picking up speed. This is due to 2 reasons. The first one is getting a foothold within the city was very difficult for the Russians because they had to go through one supply route. They now have several supply routes, which allows for a significant concentration of forces. They'll be regularly resupplied throughout the city, which allowed for a much stronger force to push through the Ukrainian defenses. The other reason is similar to the Battle of Avdiivka. the Russians bombarded Pokrovsk completely with FAB bombs. This was also reported by the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. But this is one such example of these cases where the Russians are launching not just singular FAB bombs. Now they do it in waves of 3 bombs, where they are ensuring that the target is destroyed. They detect a target, concentration forces, apartment complex building, whichever target it is, they then throw 3 bombs at it, because the accuracy is not 100%. It is somewhere around 50 meters accuracy. So usually when they throw 3 bombs, I think that's the magical number for them, where they pretty much ensure that the target has been destroyed. This is one of such examples in the Battle of Pokrovsk, where the Russians bombarded a position of the Ukrainians, concentration of their forces defending the city, with 3 FAB bombs. The combination of heavy firepower and a significant amount of forces within the city allowed the Russians to quickly gain control over the apartment complex areas, both in the Shakhtarsk district and the central parts of the city. This also allowed them to redirect their forces in the direction of the E50 highway, cutting off the supplies of the Ukrainians, limiting their supplies and reinforcements entry into the city, and securing the western flank of the city. This allowed them to now concentrate on the eastern flank, where they're encircling the Ukrainian forces that have withdrawn to the northeastern apartment complex area, where they are bombarding it with artillery and FAB bombs, just as the other areas have been, which will force a Ukrainian withdrawal or a significant attrition of the forces in the area, which will then allow them to gain control of it. If the Ukrainians decide to withdraw, well, the Russians are now on the flanks to attack them with direct fire and push them out in the direction of Milnerad rather than outside the city, which complicates the withdrawal of the forces away from the area. To the north of Pokrovsk, the Russians have managed to regain control over the fortifications here to the south of Zaporizhzhia and Soretsk, which again confirms the Ukrainian capture of both of these settlements. I previously left them in a gray zone because the Russians were claiming that fighting was still ongoing for these settlements, but it turns out their description of fighting ongoing was no longer a fighting for holding on to these towns, but instead fighting to recapture these towns. So fighting does indeed continue in both of Zaporizhzhia and Soretsk, but the Russians were kicked out of them and are now trying to re-enter through the Dacha area in between Zaporizhzhia and Soretsk, as they still hold control over the fortifications on the southern flank. So fighting continues over Zaporizhzhia and Soretsk, while the Ukrainians are attempting to push in the direction of Fedorivka to regain control over the settlement and push in the direction of Boykivka and the Kaseny-Turets river line. To the southwest of this, the Russians continued offensive operations in the vicinity of Novopavlivka, where they managed to regain control over the fortifications on the northern outskirts of Dashne, fully securing the area, and are flanking from the eastern flank as well to operationally encircle the Ukrainian forces here to the south of Novopavlivka. They've already gained a foothold in the southwestern parts of the town with operational encirclements to quickly gain control over the areas north of Dashne and push through to the Hourglass Formation with a combined attack from the western, eastern, and southern flanks. The Russians will have control over the road leading into Novopavlivka from the south, significantly strengthening the offensive operations in that direction and gaining control over Novopavlivka, which will then act as a logistical hub for offensive operations in the Dnipropetrovsk region from the eastern outskirts, with the highway connecting from the Donetsk city itself through Kurakhove in the south and up through the highway towards Novopavlivka. It will act as the forward base of their logistics for offensive operations in the direction of Meshova in the north and through Ivanivka to the western flank here in the vicinity of Andreevka, Klevtsove, and the Vovcha river line for offensive operations here within the Dnipropetrovsk region. The Russians will soon begin a battle over the highway between Pokrovsk and Huliapole in the south, which means the control over Novopavlivka and an additional supply route through the highway here in the eastern flank will strengthen Russian offensive operations towards Pokrovsk itself, especially if they're able to cross over the river line and flank the fortifications from the southern bank of the Vovcha river line. Further southwest, the Russians continued offensive operations to the west of Stepnohirsk, where they managed to gain control over the fortifications here within the Dacha area along the Dnieper River. The Russians have reached the southern outskirts of the next portion of the front line, where they'll be working on flanking the fortifications here in the outskirts of the Dacha area, where they'll be looking to flank it from the rear to attack it from its weak points, which overlooks Stepnohirsk itself. This means the Russians will be looking to gain control of the fortifications on the northern flank overlooking the town before attacking the town itself, where gaining control of these fortifications will allow them to gain full control over the E105 highway leading into Sevnohirsk from the west, and with the securing of the fortifications and the positions here south of the river line, the Russians will be able to enter from the southern and eastern flanks. So fighting continues over Sevnohirsk. The Russians reversed the situation after the Ukrainian counterattack and have yet again secured the Dasha area, and they're now threatening the final fortifications. In the northeastern direction, there are additional advances of the Russians here in the direction of Kościanivka. This is to the eastern flank of Ivanopilya, where the Russians were geolocated on the eastern flank of the town. The Russians here are fighting over the farm area following the capture of the fortifications here on the eastern flank, where they are slowly pushing through to gain full control over the eastern flank of Ivanopilya. The fortifications on the flank of Ivanopilya to cover the advances through the town itself, gain control over which will allow the Russians to have direct control over the highway leading into Kościanivka from the south, where their logistics is still not very powerful, as they only have one road leading into the city, which is through the Dasha area. It has a little cover, but not much. Gaining control over Ivanopilya will allow for the railway to be under their control all the way to the city, and the highway as well, adding 2 additional supply routes to the first one, and will also have additional cover through the town of Ivanopilya itself, the residential area, and the forest lines along the railway area. So 2 additional supply lines that are even better than the first one. In the direction of Leman, the Russians re-entered into the town of Stavki, expanding their bridgehead and foothold within the town beyond the first street and into the central parts, where the Russians are slowly pushing to gain full control of it, which will secure the road from Sarishne in the east all the way to Drobyshev in the west. As the fighting continues over the defensive lines of the Ukrainians outside of Leman to the north and east of the city. To the north of this, the Ukrainians managed to regain control over the town of Borivka and Derivka. The majority of it, the eastern road, is still contested and partially under Russian control. The Russians hold control over the fortifications into the town. The Ukrainians managed to regain control of it by pushing from the northern and southern streets through the town and pushed the Russians out. The Russians did not have a strong foothold within it, and the Ukrainians took advantage of it. While the geolocated footage confirms the Ukrainian presence within it and a Russian strike on those positions with FPV drones and artillery. To the north of this, in the direction of Kupiansk, the Ukrainians managed to regain control over Radkivka. The Frontline was clarified in the direction of Moskovka. The Russians hold control over the eastern flank. The central parts is contested, and the Ukrainians hold control over the western flank. And with this, the Ukrainians have now re-secured Radkivka here on the northern flank, where they continue fighting over the fortifications and the road leading to and from the northern flank up towards Kupiansk. This is to gain full control over the supply routes leading into Kupiansk from the north and encircle the Russian grouping of forces operating within the town. The Russians in turn are attacking the eastern flank, looking to gain control over eastern Kupiansk to secure the eastern flank, while already defending the western flank and northern flank of the city. The Russians are looking to hold control over the supply situation as long as possible, but defending and redirecting supplies to Kupiansk is extremely difficult. Therefore, the Russians are trying to improve the supply situation by gaining control over the eastern parts of Kupiansk. Gaining control over the entire town will allow them to have a secure supply line through the eastern bank of the Oskil River line, crossing over to supply their forces there, and have their forces and supplies in the northern flank be completely redirected to the defense of the northern flank, and then potential counterattacks to regain control over Moskovka and the Radkivka direction to secure the supplies going into Kupiansk from the north, and then additional offensive operations in the direction of Petropavlivka and through Satove to the eastern flank of Kupiansk, and having a secure supply line across the eastern bank of the Oskil River line into Kupiansk on the western bank, and to encircle the Ukrainian forces in the Kupiansk section of the front line. Finally, in the direction of Kamyanka, the Russians have managed to secure the northern parts with dispersed buildings and the fortified areas here in the western flank of the town. With complete control over Kamyanka, the road is now open to the flank of Zaporizhzhia and the positions of the Ukrainians in the northeastern parts of Kamyanka. The Russians will look to connect their forces between Kamyanka and Polohivka and Odoratne in the north, to connect their forces along the border area and start offensive operations towards the settlements here along the road connecting from Fyholivka in the south all the way to Hryhorivka in the north. The fighting will take place over Ambarne and then onwards towards Hryhorivka on the northern flank, towards Kolodziesane, from Kamyanka and to Voronezh from Kamyanka and Bolohivka in the north, and then finally through Fyolivka towards Petroivanivka and from Krasnopersia towards Mitrofanivka. So a general offensive operation along the settlements here along the road to connect their forces between the northern, eastern and southern parts of the northeastern section of the front line in the Kharkiv region between the borders of the Belgrade and Kharkiv regions. And that's going to be all for this update. Thank you for having the patience to go through this long update. Unfortunately, it dragged on to a long time, but thank you all for watching and have a great day.